Hello, everyone. Can I say how delighted I am to be invited to speak to you today? I'd like to begin by congratulating the Cybernetics Society on your Golden Jubilee. My talk will cover cyber systemics at the Open University, an invitation, how to act in the Anthropocene, and cyber systems thinking in practice, or STiP as we call it at the Open University, where I'll unpack the ideas about systems sensibility, literacy, or competence and capability, and finally explore what next. Can I begin by congratulating the Society on behalf of the Applied Systems Thinking Group at the Open University, where I've been based since 1994. Also from the International Federation for Systems Research, of which I'm president, and the American Society of Cybernetics and the Bertalanffy Center for the Study of System Sciences, all of which I have roles within. So let's get going. Cyber systemics at the Open University. Firstly, let's clarify some terminology. I use the term cyber systemic because we at the Open University have drawn on both cybernetics and systems, and many people do. I don't see cybernetics and systems as firmly bounded domains of intellectual activity or practice. And in conjunction with the late Gary Boyd, who was Professor of Education at Concordia University in Montreal, we decided at an ASC meeting some years ago that we would try and refocus our concerns on the term cyber systemics. We were educators and we drew in both of our respective fields on both systems and cybernetics understandings, and he coined the term cyber systemics. And so following in his footsteps, I choose to use this term whenever I think it's appropriate. The Open University, for those of you who don't know, is the UK's largest university. We've got 160,000 students who study at a distance. It was set up to foster lifelong learning, increased participation in higher education. A module in our work is not 15 people who can make a master's program work. It's an investment of up to £500,000, and we need a certain number of students to make that investment justifiable. This government's policy and the previous coalition government's policy has been lousy for higher education, particularly part-time education, and our numbers have fallen from about 250,000 to 160,000. We hope that things may change, but given this government, who knows? Systems practice at the OU began in 1971, so just after the start of this society. Systems and design were seen in the Faculty of Technology as key process disciplines that were to work in close collaboration with more conventional subject disciplines. They would contextualise and synthesise the subject disciplines and act as catalysts for interdisciplinarity. And it's nice that Jeff Johnson is here from the design discipline that was, and the systems discipline that was, and we are now in a common school together. In the very first module course that was developed, systems behaviour, in 1972, if you look at the readings and the chapters in this reader, they draw on what we might regard as traditionally systems ideas, but also cybernetic ideas and mainstream cybernetic thought. We produced courses in food production systems and expanded into postgraduate education from undergraduate education with a pioneering program in environmental decision making. And we now have, since 2010, run a master's program in systems thinking in practice. It's been very successful within the context of the OU, and the OU is committed to reinvesting in it to expand it and continue it beyond 2020. We pioneered, as part of our pedagogy, the use of systemic inquiry and systems diagramming as of ways for people to engage with complex situations, and that draws on both systems ideas and cybernetic ideas. The Institute for Apprentices has just approved a new apprenticeship, or at least in process in systems thinking, and so we would anticipate that we'll be providing education for a new master's level apprentice called the Systems Thinking Practitioner. And that brings me to the book on which the rest of my talk is based. This was written based on my own scholarship and as a preparation for one of the core modules in our master's program. This is the second edition of the book, first published in 2010. So I want to, in a way, very briefly unpack some of the key ideas that are in that book and thus in one of our core modules. And this is an invitation to you to think about how you are acting or how we might act in the Anthropocene. I'm pleased that the word Anthropocene has already been used. What it means, if you accept the term Anthropocene, is that we are actually in a period that is completely new to human history. Never before have we accepted an explanation that we humans are a force of nature and thus capable of totally changing the conditions of life on Earth. So if we accept that framing as a new Earth epoch, which is what's under consideration, then everything we have done before, business as usual, is really up for grabs. So the foundations on which we build our governance, thinking, practice, institutions and investment are essentially may not be fit for purpose. And one only has to look around at what is going on around the globe to find lots of evidence and validation of that claim. If one looks at the global systemic processes, the water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, all of these have been massively disturbed and undermined by human action and human activity. This is a photograph I took in 2008 in the Dead Sea, which is in the border between Jordan and Israel. You know its significance in Christian thought. This arrow up on the left points to where the Dead Sea used to be when it was full and the Jordan River was actually delivering water to the Dead Sea. It's been falling for years at about 1 metre per annum. Great sinkholes have opened up in it. And if you were to go to the mouth of the Jordan where it enters and go to where Christ was baptised, put a baby in, would you be flat out finding the water? But if you did find the water, the baby would die. It's so polluted. So there's a real prospect for a dead sea. And I would claim that this is a metaphor, and the reason I use it, for what all the Abrahamic faiths have led us to at this particular historical moment. We can duck out of the Abrahamic faiths and perhaps go to China. This is the 13th five-year plan for ecological and environmental protection. China's got massive environmental and pollution problems. These are the core issues that the next five-year plan has to address. Whether they will is another matter. I take some heart from the fact that they're specifying holistic management of these issues. In 2009, I was in Melbourne, and this is what happened to the railway lines when the temperature on a particular day reached 47 degrees. The steel tolerances were not able to deal with that. And we've entered a world where the discourse about climate change is of a change in 1 or 2 degrees C mean temperature. Those mean temperatures mean nothing, really, in mathematical terms. It's the duration of extremes and variation that is the absolute killer in all of this. And almost all of our engineering around the world is going to be up for reassessment around its tolerance, its designs, and its fitness for purpose. So we really need to rethink our thinking and practice in the Anthropocene.
We are here, roughly, but our mindset is somewhere back in the 18th or 19th century. And there is a real question about what we are collectively going to do about it. So if we come closer to home as a group of people interested in systems and cybernetics, what opportunities do we have? Well, I'm going to explore what we've been doing, developing reflexive cyber-systemic praxis skills through ongoing systemic inquiry. One of the central questions in my book and in the work of one of our modules is to ask the question from Umberto Maturana, what do we do when we do what we do? This is a second-order question which demands reflexivity on our human circumstances. And you might then expand that to say, well, what do we do when we claim we do cybernetics? And we've had some interesting presentations of that this morning. And what do we do when we claim we do systems? And what do we do when we invent and use terms such as Earth system or social ecological system, farming system or food system? And how is the system part understood and used? In other talks, I would claim that the concept system has gone feral. It's escaped its conceptual and rigorous basis. And we have if we want to stay with this concept, we have a need to rein it back in, intellectually and methodologically. And what is the nature of the social processes, such as governing? Well, I'd start by saying all practice, including research, is situated and embodied. All observations require an observer. Everything said is said by someone. All knowing is doing. And all observers, practitioners, actors have a history, a tradition of understanding out of which they think and act. If that's our starting point, then what we do in my book and in our module is we use what Umberto Maturana calls an isophore. An isophore is a set of dynamics in one domain that can be applied in another domain, whereas a metaphor is something that takes you from one thing to another thing. So it's a different notion than metaphor. So the juggler is a key isophore that we unpack in our module, where those balls that are being juggled in the isophore are our own being, how we understand our own cognition, reflexivity, our own practice, how we engage with situations, how we contextualize our practice to situations, and how we manage ourselves in a performance with others. Understanding practice, some basics about any form of practice. Practice is a relational dynamic. It involves the traditions of understanding of the researchers or practitioners, and choices can be made about our theoretical frameworks, about situations, about practitioner modes, about methodology, and about how we put all of those together to enact a particular type of performance. And we use different things in those processes. Unfortunately, we live in a projectified world, which I guess, to pick up Andrew's point, has the project is an institution which carries within it an ontology of knowability, because it assumes you know what you're going to do before you start. It builds in aims, objectives, and deliverables, and all of those things right at the beginning. Whereas our module is built on the idea that essentially the future is unknowable and that we need to engage in an ongoing systemic inquiry into our own knowing and the situations of our acting. Now, you won't read this slide, but if you just get a general sense of it, over on the right is a whole set of different contemporary cyber systemic approaches. If you go to the literature or the web or whatever, it ranges from RAND Corporation systems analysis way down to Ulrich's, say, critical systems heuristics at the bottom. These are all systems and cybernetics approaches which are recognizable within the literature. And if you think about all the precursors to those, well, one can identify practical holism, general systems theory, operations search, interdisciplinary studies, complexity sciences arising out of Ashby and first-order cybernetics, and second-order cybernetics. So we've seen and heard some of those this morning. And of course, these areas stand on a whole set of other lineages of understanding. And of course, all of these have different practitioners, different people who've taken these ideas and put them into practice in particular ways, distinctions, developed methods, methodologies, theories, etc. And several of these people have been mentioned this morning. But I want to talk I want to make two distinctions. I would claim that if you look at those contemporary systems and cybernetics approaches, that those towards the top are inhabited by practitioners who choose to see, knowingly or not, systems as ontologies, systems as things in the world, which can be modelable, describable, etc. So in Andrew's language, they may be ontologies of knowability. And he probably won't like me because my next distinction is to say that the other set are those people who see, who confront situations of concern, complexity, uncertainty, and use systems as epistemological devices to know about that uncertainty in those situations. And they could be, if I were to use other language or Andrew's framing, they could be the ontologies of unknowability. So the question is, where does this whole field going next? Here's the distinction, what I call the systemic and the systematic. I spy complexity and confusion, but I can organise exploration of it by thinking of systems as a device for learning. Or I spy systems which I can engineer. And we use this heuristic in our course, our modules, to make the point that we don't see these distinctions as an either-or, a dualism, a self-negating pair. We invite people to climb up the ladder out of their mainstream paradigm, which is usually the systematic paradigm, where linear cause and effect or control and hierarchy operate, into a more systemic understanding and systemic worldview, and to be able to use both systemic and systematic understandings, methods, practices when the conditions are appropriate. In other words, to act as if these are a duality. I mean, we see this all the time in political work. I mean, whether so much policy is developed through using the systematic have problem, create response. Nowhere is it more worse than in every nation's road building policies, where governments, despite the knowledge to the contrary, continue to build motorways and to build better and better roads, which create all sorts of unintended negative consequences. Now, this is my test for a So I just want to invite you to watch this. Okay. What we discover in all works of life, and particularly in our education, is there are very few people who can think and act relationally or systemically. These different lineages produce a whole set of differences which we're grappling with in a community like this. They favour different concepts, methods, techniques, have different standards of evidence, effectiveness, involve and or privilege different practices. But if you like, wearing particularly my International Federation for Systems Research hat, where I'm greatly concerned about how over the last 50 years of our existence as organisations, as academics in this field, we seem to have exacerbated our differences rather than understanding, appreciating and institutionalising our commonalities. I want to know, are our commonalities greater than our differences? Do they draw on similar histories and concepts? Do they, in Checkland's words, generate understandings and changes that are systemically desirable and culturally feasible? And what political, cultural and institutional capital have we collectively built, or could we collectively build? If we are in an Anthropocene and we think our ideas are a counter to the dominance of a particular paradigm that has got us there, then surely we have a responsibility. I want to now just talk a bit about some learning from our education of systems practitioners, and which we now use. Many of the students who come into our program find the experience extremely liberating, because they suddenly discover that there's a set of ideas and concepts which relate to how they experience and understand the world, but which they often sublimate because it's not the mainstream. And so these people feel very liberated. There are another group of students who have what we call the aha moment, the idea that you can actually think about your thinking and you can think in different ways. And there are another group of people who get very alienated by our program because it challenges who they are and challenges their identity and their commitment to their traditional ways of thinking and acting. And often that generates anger and rejection. Now, out of these experiences, I would have come to claim that we humans are born into a world with what I will call a systemic sensibility. The world we come to live in is replete with relationship, our cognition, all of these issues. But only a very limited number of people move beyond this innate sensibility, which is often lost because of our traditional education system. We don't have much systems literacy developed in school and education, and we have even less system thinking and practice capability developed. And what's more, these properties have to exist inside a technosphere and a biosphere, which we're now calling the Anthropocene. For those of you who don't know the word technosphere, it's comprised of all of the structures that humans have constructed to keep them alive on the planet, from houses, factories and farms to computer systems, smartphones and CDs, to the waste in landfills. Latest calculation, some 30 trillion tonnes of material. So the life of a baby, as I said, is replete with practices that cultivate a systemic sensibility. All of these phenomena have relational dynamics in common. Living in a relational world, an evolutionary context that we're born into, and coming to be aware of relational dynamics are the essence of what I mean by a systemic sensibility. And perhaps, Martin, just to pick up on a point you made in your slide, 50% of the human DNA in our bodies is not human. We are actually an ecology of species. We are not a single organism. And the whole work on the microbiome and everything that's going on at the moment makes that very clear. And at long last, we are beginning to understand our ecologies and how our gut is as much a part of our cognitive systems as our brain, and may even be more important than it. Now, this is on your web page, and this is the classic, cybernetic, if you like, metaphor or story. Ampere used the word to describe the science of civil government in 1834, Norbert Wiener's famous book. But what happened when Norbert Wiener took up the word and the notion was that it became taken up in noun form. He didn't really take it up in the verb form, which is the action of steering. And if you think about the action of steering in the context from which it came, then you have a steerer. All steering is done by a steerer in this metaphor. And what are they doing? They're moving the rudder in relation to feedback from both the biophysical world, currents and oceans, winds, etc., and the social world, because why are they steering? Where are they going? What's their motivation? What are the rules of the game? Etc. So all of these are determining the set of relational dynamics that gives rise to the practice of sailing. And of course there are technologies that mediate that, including the designs of boats, etc. So I would claim that we still have not exploited, in the way that it was really designed to be exploited, that foundation metaphor of what cybernetics is about. And we've come stuck, unfortunately, in a set of unhelpful metaphors for human communication. This is from Klaus Krippendorf's work, his paper where he talked about the main metaphors of human communication. And we know that these metaphors are pervasive, widespread, but if you think about it seriously, the only one that actually is based in biology and social life is the dance ritual metaphor. Because we are, in essence, conversational beings, to take a Paskian term. And whatever I'm saying here at the moment, I've got no way of knowing whether you are interpreting me in any way that relates to what I think I'm saying. So we are constantly in a dance of conversation, meaning construction, etc. So what next? Well, I would claim we've got to invent a new social system which has different oars, different ways of practicing governance, thinking, investing, institutionalising. We are now in a society that has a dominant systematic sensibility, linear cause-effect, magic bullets, simple outcomes. Our systemic sensibility is repressed. We've got no investment much in systems literacy, and our systems thinking and practice capability, by and large, is very minimal. As we ought to be able to carry within us both a systematic and a systemic sensibility. We ought to have much more systems literacy than we've currently got, and we need much more practice capability to use these ideas to transform the world we live in. One only has to turn to the systemic failure of governance by governance. 2 books, Ed Straw's Stand and Deliver, a design for successful government, a reimagining of the whole British government system. John Sedney's work where he points out the inadequacies of the Whitehall models. I'm working with Ed Straw at the moment on a book to reimagine what a new governance system would be or look like. This is how essentially our 18th, 19th, 20th century governance model is a relationship between civil society, state, judiciary, law, the private sector, with the media floating around somewhere in that configuration. But all of the dynamics between these are founded on understandings and institutions that come from the 18th and 19th centuries. They precede the rise of multinationals that are bigger than 70% of nation states. They precede the connectivity that arises through internet and other things. It precedes the recognition that we are in the Anthropocene. And so in this particular alternative model, we propose the addition of 3 central new elements. The biosphere at the centre, the technosphere, a foundation which has to be done. I, for one, don't think we can any longer tolerate what I would call laissez-faire capitalism's development of technology. I would argue, in all honesty, why the hell do we need driverless cars? That sort of thing. There are all those issues which we as a society have to grapple with, and we have not historically grappled with them at all. And at the moment, the state is totally inadequate as a device for dealing with social purpose. Education is a zigzag driven ideologically from one election cycle to another. So the investment of a society in itself through education is failing systemically, as is our whole well-being, as evidenced by the complete failure to deal with air pollution in the city in which we're here at the moment. So we need to develop new long-term citizens-based processes to renegotiate and re-articulate social purpose. There's some exciting things going on. The OECD is taking seriously these approaches and doing some nice work in various member countries. We're doing our bit through our programs at the Open University, and we will continue to, I can say that the OU will continue to invest in those into the 2020s. So what are the priorities for the road ahead as I see them? Well, to recognise that our traditions of understanding are the basis for how we think and act as our living unfolds, and if our living is unfolding in the wrong direction, we've got to challenge those. We are born with systemic sensibilities, but these may be lost through our education, but can be recovered and enhanced with systems literacy and system thinking and practice capability. Here's a program for investment. Our future within an Anthropocene that is human-created demands actions that foster institutional death when judged necessary. A lot of what we do at the moment has got to go. And we need to know how to kill off institutions. We don't do it very well. And crafts new governing practices and structures that avoid lock-in or path dependency, i.e. are constantly open to changing circumstances. And this is what constitutes, in the circumstances, ethical practice. Scranton, in his lovely essay, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of Civilization, says, "We can continue acting as if tomorrow will be just like yesterday, growing less and less prepared for each new disaster as it comes, and more desperately invested in a life we can't sustain. Or we can learn to see each day as the death of what came before, freeing ourselves to deal with whatever problems the present offers without attachment or fear." And I like to think that this is what Heinz von Forster was advocating when he said, act always so as to increase the number of choices. We can lock ourselves in to this business as usual central pathway, or we can be open to a range of different future possibilities. Thank you.